Good evening readers, it's Tilly here from Tilly's Shelf and welcome to week 1 of Sagalong. So Sagalong is now an annual event in which we indulge ourselves in the reading of sagas. I believe for the first Sagalong we read the saga of Gunlag Wormtongue or Serpent Tongue, and then for the second Sagalong and then a couple of others, definitely a couple of others. Maybe the saga of Eric the Red, and then the second Sagalong here, each channel chose something different. Here we read the Volsunga saga, which has a serpenty dragony thing that gets slain and some magical rings and stuff like that. And also as the group read we did the Laxdala saga, or the saga of the people of Laxdal, which is a longer family saga involving blood feuds and things. And this year we're all group reading the same book, and the same book that we're reading is Njal saga, and Njal saga is another long family saga with blood feuds. It's like, how many times can I say saga in one video without starting to sound quite silly? And yeah, so I think in previous years when we've done Sagalong, people, by people I mean probably Steve Donahue, have made comments like, why are you reading all of these like naff little sagas? Like, you should be reading Njal sagas. Njal saga is the best saga. And I'm 40 chapters in now because that's the target. Each week is 40 chapters. And I would say I have to agree. I'm really, really enjoying this and I'm really getting quite a lot out of it. And yeah, so it's time to discuss, because Saturday is the day that we post the videos. There are some really brilliant co-hosts for this year, and they've posted some really interesting and fascinating videos on their thoughts, and I'll try and link as many of them as I can below. Probably not right now, because right now, after this, I need to go to bed, but I will link them below afterwards, or you can search Sagalong 2021, and they're all coming up quite easily for me. And Likash at A Cruel Reader's Thesis is one of those co-hosts, and he was saying that our videos, like for the first 40 chapters, are going to be substantial, be more substantial and requiring more thought. This isn't going to be very substantial, and I haven't put a lot of thought into it. I have made some notes, so I'm trying my best, but I'm not pretending to be any great expert on sagas. The one thing that I would say is that sagas improve the more of them that you read. So there is a lot of crossover between characters. I think somebody was comparing them to, Scott was comparing it to like a soap opera, and it is like a soap opera in that it's this kind of like, the more sagas you read, the more it's like a really, really long-term soap opera. These characters come back. I mean, I've never really watched soap operas, but I'm assuming here. These characters come back that like maybe you thought were dead, or you thought something else had happened to them, and then they just crop up and they're doing something else, and you're like, hey, I know that guy. And the more sagas that you read, the more you get that kind of experience of like the sense of recognition and the little spark of, he did something important that other time. Like, I should probably remember that. And I think that really feeds into the amount that I'm enjoying this saga is having characters like Hrut and Huskald came up in the saga of the people of Laxdal. There is a character who's mentioned who's like, the grandson of one of the characters in the Volsunga saga. And yeah, it all feeds in nicely together, and they also refer to people who are like king and queen in Norway who have come up in various other events. And that's just generally like, it's a really pleasant experience for me, and it's something that yeah, I feel like the first few sagas that I read were a lot of work, and some of them were more work than it felt like they were worth, but I've really reached like a new level of saga with Njal saga, because it's got the quality, it's got some really good characterization. Somebody else was talking about that. Who was talking about that? I've tried to write down what people have, when people have said interesting things, I've tried to write it down, and now I'm just completely in a mess. Let's move swiftly on. Somebody was talking about how fantastic the characterization is in this. It is. There are loads of unique characters who really seem to have like their own motivations and their own sense of agency. And then there's also this better understanding of the society and the legal system and the rhythm of the year in Iceland that you gain the more sagas that you read. So I'm glad that this wasn't my first ever saga, because coming at this already knowing what the old thing is and already knowing, like, recognizing some of the names is really helpful. But you definitely could come to this completely new. One thing I think Elizabeth at Bookish North said, you can just ignore the names, and that would be, I think that's the best advice for reading sagas, is just ignore the names until you realise that somebody's a main character. because this is Njal's saga, but we don't actually meet Njal until like around 20 chapters in. And the first few times when I was reading sagas and I was reading about these people and knowing that it wasn't like their saga, it's really confusing. It's like, I thought we were getting one story, but we seem to be getting another story. And you go on this like really big meander and really big detour, and then suddenly it's like, oh, and then there was this man called Njal, and you're like, oh, it's him. And the thing that I've kind of come to work out is it is worth it, and there is a point to these meanders. It sometimes doesn't appear until much later in the saga. And this one, even within the first 40 chapters, some of those characters from the earlier meander have already worked their way back in. So you just get this appreciation of the fact that if the saga is Njal's saga, but they've chosen to start like 3 steps removed from Njal, there is a reason for that, even though it might not be immediately obvious. Sometimes less so, but sometimes it feels like there is a real purpose to where they choose to start the story. Which I guess is the other thing to say about sagas, particularly like this one. It is a kind of a blend of legend and mythology and historical fact. There are some certain events that happen in the later part of this saga that I stupidly read the introduction and have found out what's going to happen. And that they know are based on historical facts. Like, people have traced it and they've said, like, you know, this event happened and it probably happened around about this time period. This event happened and it probably happened around about this time period. Those time periods do not match up with the time period in the saga as it is presented to us. So we already know that it is not historically accurate. Then we have things like, we have a kind of a manipulative witch queen character who casts a curse. Like, you could say maybe the curse just happens to come to pass, or maybe she actually did successfully cast a curse, and, you know, like bewitched weapons and things like that, that are very definitely fictional, and they come together in this really beautiful blend. So yeah, what you end up with is kind of like a web where there is like a main strand that is this key character, which in this case is Njal, and feeding into that you've got strands of fact, you've got strands of mythology, you've got strands of different sagas also like weaving in together, and then hitting that web is like the fly hitting the web, and it sends out like this ripple effect and all the spiders start moving in, and like one little thing, in this case, like a betrothal and somebody going away before that betrothal happens, and then things just kind of start to spiral out. One little thing sets the whole saga in motion, and then it gets bloody when the spiders reach the flies, I suppose. One of the things I found interesting in this saga is that inciting event where this man named Hrut gets betrothed to a woman named Un, but before he can carry on and get married to her, he receives news that means that he has to go away to Norway, and he like goes and he says, right, let's get married after 3 years, and I'm going to go away to Norway in between that time period. And I believe in the Saga of Gunlag Serpent Tongue, a similar kind of thing happens where 2 people are in love and they decide to get married, but the guy is like, oh, I have to go away, I have to go on a raiding trip before we can get married, and he goes away and he doesn't manage to come back in time. So I had this sense of like expectation of that plan not coming to fruition. But the weird thing about this saga is they keep making plans that they feel like they shouldn't be able to pan out. But the things that they plan work, it's just they don't necessarily work out in the right way, or the things that happen as a result of the things that they've planned don't happen in the right way. So yeah, he does manage to come back after 3 years, and he does manage to get married, but his marriage doesn't turn out very well because he's been cursed by a malicious witch queen thing. Or later on, there is this whole like convoluted story of like a couple of times it happens where somebody narrates this plan. It's like, oh, well, I'll tell you exactly what you need to do. You need to go to this place and you need to say this thing, and then that person's probably going to say this thing. And like they give a real like step by step of this is exactly how the future's going to happen. And it's like if you were reading Thomas Hardy, or if you were reading even like maybe Greek myths, the person would go out and like set out to carry out that plan, but something would tragically intervene and then they just wouldn't be able to complete on that plan. But in these, like in Njal's saga, that's exactly what happens. Somebody says, oh, if you say this person will say this. And that actually happens. It's really quite weird. But then the things that they hope as the outcome of that doesn't necessarily happen. So I just mentioned a minute ago this guy Hrut, who goes away on a raiding tour to Norway, or he goes away to Norway, and I kind of wanted to mention that as another kind of recurring saga theme, as this like young man gets on a boat and goes away to Norway, and it's a real coming of age moment in the different sagas, and sometimes it's the central moment of the saga, or sometimes it's just a step on the hero's journey. So it's a step in his road to becoming an accomplished sagic hero figure. Hrut is the main character of like the first few chapters, and then it passes over to Njal and Njal's best friend Gunnar. Gunnar also goes on one of these raiding voyages, and it's another important feature of them as well, is going back to Norway and gaining the approval, succeeding in battles on land and overseas, but also gaining the approval of the king. And what I find really interesting is that it's such an important status thing for these young men, and it's such a big topic in these books that they gain the approval of kings, not necessarily just in Norway. I think Gunnlaug gains approval of kings in what is now England. Some of them go to other places. I think somebody in one of the sagas went all the way like to kind of the Middle East and gained the approval of kings like down there. It's seen as like such a desirable thing, and yet they come from a country that doesn't have a king. They actually come from a republic, and the government and system of law is a really important feature in this book as well. And there is a lot about the kind of cyclical nature of the year and the importance of the All-Thing, which was kind of like a governmenty legal meeting that happened over a fortnight once a year every summer, and everyone went and met all their friends and had all their legal disputes, and everyone kind of had their own booth, and kind of they would be able to talk to each other about trade and things. It's my imagination of the thing, from what I've gathered from the notes in these books and so on. It's really interesting, like seeing how that governing system plays out, and seeing this massive emphasis that is put on the laws that are talked about in the All-Thing, despite the fact that those laws are very, very fragile. There's a comment on the introduction to this, which I think is by, is it Robert Cook? Let me just find out quickly. Oh. No, doesn't. Translated and edited by Robert Cook, so let's assume that he wrote the introduction as well. There is a comment that they didn't have the infrastructure to back up the laws that they had. They had a very weak state. They obviously didn't have a police system, so they would have these legal debates and they would have these legal discussions, and then they would say, look, this is the fair way to divide up somebody's dowry, and then somebody would come along, as happens in this saga, and say, yeah, okay, we can accept that ruling, or we can just fight for it. And quite a lot of the time they end up either just fighting for it, or like if you refuse to fight for it, you kind of relinquish your claim to something. So if you know that if you fight for it, you're going to die, then you just have to give it up, and somebody is able to just by threat take what legally would be rightfully yours. It's such a weird and interesting system, which I guess is like, it's like the meeting point between trying to have some kind of bureaucracy almost, versus having a society that is essentially based on brute force. Brute force and the manipulation of people who can enact brute force by people who can't. So there are several really great female characters in this. I don't say really great as in they're lovely people who you would really want to have as your friends, but really great as in really like malevolent and dark and cunning, I guess. One of them is Halgerd. I think Elizabeth pronounced that as like Hollywood or something very, very different, but Halgerd is what it says in my book, so that's how it is in my head. And she kind of persuades these bad characters to go around killing people for her, even though like as a woman she doesn't do any of the fighting. So yeah, I guess it's about who is able to wield both force itself and control the people who can enact that force, I suppose. There are repercussions from stepping outside of the legal system. There was quite a system of people being outlawed. There's also a real reputational thing. So one of these brute force characters, I think he's called Theokstolf, I think, it said, oh, he was not a good man. He had killed several people without paying any compensation. And the idea of there needing to be compensation for a death comes up time and again in these first 40 chapters, to the point that we see like there's two kind of like parallel systems of compensation. And one of those is a monetary compensation where each life is valued depending on the status of that life in society. And there is also a blood feud side of like, you killed one of mine, so I'm going to kill one of yours. And I think that blood feud thing is something that we're still fascinated with today. Like, you still see kind of like soaps or gang films, or like, yeah, like I'm thinking of the Lebanese drama that I watched while I was in Lebanon, where it was like a kind of like a mafia style thing, and it's very much like a tit for tat arrangement, and we still use that as a way of building tension in our stories. Like, one person dies, so another person has to die, so another person has to die, so another person has to die. That is the tension that you're getting in the first 40 chapters of this. It delays, but in the last little section of this week's chunk, we've just got death after death after death after death, and that like the kind of like the stepping up and the ramping up, and we can tell that it's leading to something that is going to be brutal and shocking, and hopefully that it's going to lead to something else on the other side. Leading to this kind of like this idea of like there's death after death and we can tell it's going somewhere, we've got characters as well who seem to be able to tell where this is going. So we've got this central character of Njal, who is kind of said to be, there is one point where he said it describes him as being like really well versed in all of the laws and all of the things that have gone previously, but also having a really good knowledge of things that are yet to come. And it's implied that he has some kind of future knowledge, I can't remember, like some kind of seeing power, and I have a feeling it's not going to end well for Njal, partially because of the spoilers that I might have had from the introduction, but no spoilers for anyone else here. I have a feeling, Njal might not have the easiest life, and I kind of have to wonder how much of that character is, how much we're supposed to think that that character does know what's going to happen, and almost. So this was written down several hundred years after the events that it is loosely based on, and it was written down after Christianity had come to be the dominant religion in Iceland. And you have to think about like a character like Njal, where he's shown as being the peacekeeper, and he's shown as being very much somebody who would always look for a reconciliation approach, or a making reparations instead of like picking up an axe and throwing it at people, which does happen quite a lot in this, not from Njal but from other characters. You have to wonder how much that character was supposed to be compared to a religious figure like Jesus, where he might be heading towards a predetermined end, but it's his behaviour leading up to that makes him a hero, and it's his behaviour not as a violent, marauding Viking type character, but as an upstanding man of society with a knowledge of laws, and who cares for his family and supports his family, and supports his friends as well. But I think what it also shows is that the peaceful approaches that Njal takes can only work if everyone supports them. So Njal is like trying to put forward this peaceful method, but it doesn't work because even people within his own family don't agree with his peaceful method. So they just go right behind his back and kill people. And he kind of knows that's going to happen as well, but he just can't stop them. And it's kind of, it's quite tragic. But then I just kind of wish he'd just be a bit more forceful with his peacefulness. Does that work? Can you do that? Is that a thing? To make sure that this doesn't happen. The final thing that I just wanted to mention, there was other things that I wanted to mention, but it's too long already. It's just the cover of this book, and I think it's absolutely beautiful. So I've said these stories were written down maybe several hundred years after they happened. So they were set in around the time late 900s, early 1000s, if that makes sense. They were written down around 1280 was the first quite complete copy of Njal's saga that we have. This is from one less than 100 years after that, 1350. What's it called? I'm not even going to try to say that. Kalfaljak manuscript, something like that. And it's just a beautiful like title, the start of one of the chapters. Just like look at this letter H with things like worked into it. And looking at it reminded me of this book that we've got, the Masterpieces of Medieval Art. And there's a couple of pieces in here that are from kind of Norway and Scandinavia. This is a walrus tusk reliquary that was again made in probably, this says it was made probably about around in between the saga being invented and the saga being written down. And just look at the really intricate patterning on there. And then another thing that was made similar time is much more well known, were the Lewis chessmen, and these were made like just maybe about 50 years before this saga was written down. Just look how intimate that is. Look how detailed that is. These were thought to have been made in Norway. And just like having this society that was making these beautiful works of art, making these comprehensive works of literature, having this really detailed legal system, even if it wasn't exactly perfect. Yeah, I just really am appreciating getting to know more of that culture and having such a window into like the characters and the values that they had. Anyway, that was 20 minutes of me gushing incoherently about sagas before bed. I hope you've enjoyed it. Please check out the videos from the other co-hosts who have been much more coherent. Yeah, I'm really enjoying being in the co-host group chat because it's hilarious, but it's really fun. And yeah, I'll hopefully be back next week with the next 40 chapters of the saga.